In this discussion, we're going to talk about Chapter 32, which is called the Fiscal Policy Dilemma. And this will actually be the last chapter that we cover this semester. There's really, there's quite a lot of material in this chapter, but I'm going to go through it fairly quickly because I'm running out of your time. So we'll start right from the beginning. There we go. We'll bring up the pen, and we will go through this, and I will try not to take up too much more than one class or one or two class periods. So in Chapter 32, we're going to talk about the fiscal policy dilemma. In Chapter 31, we talked about the mechanics of the budgeting process, and we defined on budget and off budget accounts, and we talked about various ways of measuring the deficit, adjusting the deficit for inflation, and we talked about the structural deficit, the cyclical deficit, and we talked about the relationship between deficits and debt and the importance of the debt to GDP ratio and when that might be a concern and when it might not be a concern. So in this chapter, we're going to kind of fine-tune our economic discussion of fiscal policy and talk about the pros and the cons of using fiscal policy as a stimulus for the economy when the economy goes into recession. And so this is quite important for us right now because we know that, who would have thought that just 13 or 14 weeks ago when we started this semester that we would be ending the semester with what is likely going to be one of the most significant recessions since the Great Depression. High unemployment. The unemployment rate right now is estimated, and this is not based on the current numbers, which don't fully reflect the shutdown of the economy, but economists do believe that the unemployment rate over the next quarter will be as high as 20%. Using Okun's rule of thumb, which I'll talk about a little bit more later in this video, that implies that the amount of output in the economy could be decreasing by as much as 30 to 40%, which is really a phenomenal slowdown in the economy. And in response to that, the government has done a number of things. They've lowered interest rates to zero and committed to unconventional monetary policy. We've already covered all of that material in detail, including an application to the current situation with COVID-19. And, of course, Congress has passed one, probably the first of several fiscal stimulus packages aimed at stabilizing aggregate demand. It's a $2 trillion package, which includes direct payments to households, $1,200 per adult, plus I believe it was, in the end, $500 per child, and it phases out as your income increases, and a very large program to help businesses see their way through the economic downturn and hopefully keep people on payroll and avoid laying too many people off. So that $2 trillion stimulus package is the largest stimulus package in U.S. history. It's likely to be followed by additional stimulus. And so we are beginning to build all the tools that we need to understand, not just that the stimulus package will shift aggregate demand to the right, and we should hope for the best, but now we know how it fits into the overall budgeting process. It's largely going to be create a cyclical, what we would call a cyclical deficit. The question will be over time, will that be built into more of a structural deficit? And we know the issues surrounding how the way that might increase the debt and the problems that the debt to GDP ratio could present for us. And what we're going to do here is just talk a little bit more theoretically about deficits. So the first objective is going to be to go back kind of historically and talk about the difference between sound finance and functional finance, two different views of fiscal policy. I would say that neither one of these two views of fiscal policy are held widely, at least in dogmatic terms, by economists today. Sound finance was the view of public finance that was taken by the classicals before the Great Depression after the Great Depression, after Keynes wrote the general theory, and there are a lot of different ways to interpret the general theory in terms of policy, but many of Keynes' followers believed in or formulated and believed in the functional finance point of view. And there really aren't very many economists today who believe in the functional finance point of view dogmatically either. So the truth is often somewhere in between. And our view of public finance depends on all of the different situations that exist in the economy at a given point in time, with a full understanding that we cannot hope to use fiscal policy to quote-unquote fine-tune the economy. So we'll talk a little bit about what I mean by fine-tuning the economy. The second objective is going to be to understand why fiscal policy and our basic policy model, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, why fiscal policy in the real world, right, is a little bit more difficult than it appears to be in that policy model. It's pretty easy to make a solid argument as to how fiscal policy might shift aggregate demand and draw a picture of it, and get the fiscal policy timed perfectly and of the right magnitude to shift the aggregate demand curve back out to full employment. But, in reality, implementing fiscal policy has a number of different limitations that we want to understand. Then we'll talk about automatic stabilizers, a pretty brief discussion, but there are certain types of fiscal policy which can automatically kick in when the economy slows down or even when it speeds up and begins to recover. And we call those automatic stabilizers, and they tend to dampen the magnitude of the business cycle. So we'll talk about what I mean by automatic stabilizers. And finally, and just briefly, I'm going to show you what I think is going on currently in the economy, wrap up with a discussion of the current economic situation as it relates to the economic shutdown associated with social distancing. So we'll talk about that a little bit too, and we'll briefly think about what we can hope to achieve with the fiscal stimulus and of course with the zero interest rate policy and unconventional monetary policy as well. So we'll wrap up there. I think in this video I'll probably cover objectives 1 and 2, and in a second brief video cover objectives 3 and 4, and then that will mark the end of our semester together. So objective 1, I'm going to cover these sub-objectives under objective 1. First, I'm going to talk about sound finance a little bit. Okay, and this is the point of view that was taken by classical economists before the Great Depression. So we'll talk about what I mean by sound finance. We all know that in response to the Great Depression, Keynes wrote the general theory. And while Keynes didn't necessarily advocate what became the functional finance point of view, his book, The General Theory, and those who called themselves Keynesians after Keynes published The General Theory, certainly at least through the 1960s took this functional finance point of view. So we'll want to understand that also. In particular, there's an economist by the name of Abba Lerner who really led the charge to take Keynes' book, his general theory, and mathematize it, if you will, and pull some rigorous policy prescriptions from it. And one of the ideas that came out of that was functional finance. And then finally, we'll explain the modern debate surrounding what I'm going to call Ricardian equivalence. Ricardian equivalence, strictly speaking, was something that classical economists did believe in. I mean, David Ricardo was a very famous classical economist, and he had this idea about the timing of the government spending and taxes, and the idea that it didn't really matter, so that running deficits, whether you run deficits or not, it's not very important. So in the end, then, the sound finance point of view we'll see is based on moralistic principles and political principles just as much as it is economic principles. So I'll explain Ricardian equivalence to you. So the sound finance point of view was the point of view that the government should basically always run a balanced budget, just like households do. And like I said, this is based as much on moralistic principles and political principles as it is on economic principles. And the one exception to when the government might want to run a budget deficit was during wartime. Whatever it takes to win a war, right? If you're fighting a war, it's okay to run budget deficits. and to finance those budget deficits by issuing bonds, by selling bonds, war bonds, right? So we're all familiar with the concept of war bonds. But other than that, the sound finance point of view, which most economists held before the Great Depression, was that just like households, governments should be responsible. Governments should be responsible by balancing their budget. And there's another reason really other than just economic grounds, as we'll see when we talk about Ricardian equivalence. The other reason is that classical economists were quite skeptical about how efficient government could be at making decisions and allocating resources. So classical economists were, and those who new classical economists today are, very skeptical of big government. And so the idea was that if you're going to tax people, right, you better have a good justification for taxing people, because people will rebel against high taxes. They won't vote for you unless you, if you are out there raising taxes to very high levels, unless you can justify spending that tax revenue on something that people, voters, find genuinely useful. And so by having the government balance their budget from year to year, the federal government, classical economists believed that they would limit the degree of growth in the federal government, and that was economically desirable on long-run principles of economic growth and the allocation of resources. So I would put it that way. So that's kind of the intersection between the economic grounds for viewing that the government should balance its budget and the political grounds, really just a skepticism in what government policy can achieve, and the idea that the government is out there running big deficits. They're financing those deficits by issuing bonds. Issuing bonds, we know, drives down bond prices. It drives up interest rates, and it's going to cause less private investment. We'll talk about that later a little bit more also, but it's going to cause less private investment. And the idea is that private citizens and businesses are better equipped to determine what productive investment looks like, and not the government. So that was the main reason that classical economists supported this idea of sound finance. Functional finance, on the other hand, is a view that really came out of Keynesian economics and the Great Depression. And it was felt, first of all, during the Great Depression, that different types of public works programs and government spending might put people back to work and make people more optimistic about their own economic situation if they were working. And those positive expectations could spill over to more spending, and through a multiplier effect, put more people back to work. And so the idea was that we shouldn't be making these decisions about whether or not to balance the budget or have a surplus or a deficit based on some moralistic principle. Instead, what we should be looking at is their impact on the economy. So if the economy is operating below potential GDP, right? If the economy is in a recessionary gap, that's the way we've been putting it in this class, then the government should run a deficit in that situation. That's what's justified by the state of the economy. But neither Keynes nor those who promoted functional finance believed that you should always run a government budget deficit. I mean, they certainly fully realized that government budget deficits in the long run would lead to higher interest rates and would crowd out private investment and private spending, and that could be detrimental to long-run growth. So the idea that Keynes or his followers believed that it was okay for the government to just run deficits all the time is just simply not true. They certainly believed that the government should run a surplus if the economy were operating beyond potential GDP. So it's really looking at the state of the economy and deciding whether or not a recessionary gap justifies deficit spending or an inflationary gap justifies more of a balanced budget. And certainly on average you should balance the budget, if not run a slight surplus when the economy is at or operating beyond potential GDP. So while I think that the Keynesians right after the Great Depression would be fully supportive of the $2 trillion stimulus package that Congress recently passed to deal with the social distancing, they probably would not have been in favor of the $1.2 trillion deficit that the GOP tax cut had created while the economy was still close to potential GDP. Okay, so functional finance seems to fit nicely into aggregate supply, aggregate demand, because basically what it does is it gives us a demand shifter to the left and right. If we're not at potential GDP, we can use functional finance point of view to justify using the government budget as one potential policy shifter for the aggregate demand curve. Okay, so with that review, I want to talk to you a little bit about Ricardian equivalence. The gentleman up here in the upper left, that is David Ricardo, a very famous classical economist. He was a stockbroker. He's the guy who came up basically with the concept of comparative advantage that you learned about probably at the beginning of your microeconomics class. And I have a new concept that he talked about in his Principles of Economics book that you probably didn't learn about in microeconomics, and that's Ricardian equivalence. Ricardian equivalence is an idea that was held widely by classical economists before the Great Depression, as functional finance and the view of functional finance kind of took over the economics professions in the post-war era. The idea of Ricardian equivalence fell by the wayside until it was revived by this gentleman on the lower right-hand side. He's a guy by the name of Robert Barrow. He's a Harvard economist. He's what we call a new classical economist, and he came up with a really nice mathematical model of Ricardian equivalence and ignited an entire research program into looking at whether or not Ricardian equivalence is something that we should be thinking about in terms of whether or not we advocate fiscal policy today. So that's Robert Barrow, and that is David Ricardo, and the ideas that I'm talking about here were first discussed by David Ricardo, but then revived by Robert Barrow in the 1980s and 1990s. So here's the basic idea of Ricardian equivalence. Ricardian equivalence basically says that budget deficits or surpluses don't impact the level of output. They have no impact whatsoever on aggregate demand. And the reason is that people will offset any change in government savings or government deficits by changing their own level of consumption and savings in anticipation of future taxes. That's the idea of Ricardian equivalence. So to fully understand Ricardian equivalence, you have to understand exponential growth and how that relates to future and present value, which are two topics that we covered briefly in class. Right? So I'm gonna give you a simple example here of Ricardian equivalence. So before we actually get to some of the conclusions about Ricardian equivalence, because there's been a lot of econometric and empirical testing of Ricardian equivalence, and the empirical record is highly mixed. But the basic theoretical idea would go something like this. Suppose that today the government gives you just a $1 tax cut. Just deal with $1 here to keep the math simple. If the government gives you a $1 tax cut today, then you're going to believe that at some point in the future, they're going to have to raise taxes to pay for their deficit spending. Now, that may happen next year, it may happen 2 years from now, it may happen 5 years from now. Let's just say that we anticipate that the government will reverse their tax cut and raise taxes to pay for what they borrowed next year. So we know that the way that the government finances this $1 deficit from giving you a $1 tax break is by issuing a $1 bond, right? Let's say the interest rate is 5%. So the government's going to borrow $1 at 5%. What will the tax bill be 1 year from now? Well, it's going to be $1.05. Okay, now they gave you $1, and now you anticipate that next year your taxes are going to go up by $1.05. Right, $1 plus interest. The government's going to borrow $1 plus pay 5% interest. They're going to pay back $1.05 a year from now. That's going to be the increase in your tax bill a year from now to pay for the $1 tax break that you got today. How much do you have to save today in order to be ready to pay that tax bill a year from now? Well, $1. Because if you save $1 today, right, then you can invest it at 5% interest. You'll have $1.05 a year from now. And when the $1.05 tax bill comes due, you'll have exactly the right amount of money to pay it. So what will you do with that $1 tax break? You'll just save it. Okay, and so in that sense, if that happens, the government's attempt to stimulate the economy with a $1 tax cut isn't going to work. You're just going to take it and save it the same way they would have saved it, right? And so the timing of government spending and taxes doesn't influence the aggregate demand curve. Literally, the impact of deficit spending on the aggregate demand curve, I'm going to show you what it is. There's the price level. There's GDP. That's aggregate demand. Are you ready? Boom. Did you see it? There it was. It doesn't shift it at all. If you can deficit spend, you can give a tax break, or you can increase government spending, right? It works the same way if you're deficit spending through an increase in government spending. If the government increases their spending by $1 and they don't raise their taxes, then they're going to have to borrow that $1. You know that your taxes are going to go up a year from now to pay for that spending. If they spend $1 today, it's going to be $1.05 that they have to pay back a year from now at 5% interest. So their increase in government spending $1 is going to be offset by a decrease in your consumption spending by $1 as you save in anticipation of that $1.05 increase in taxes next year. So the aggregate demand curve doesn't shift. It's logically a beautiful argument, right? Ricardian equivalence. It's really appealing to economists because it's not something that's immediately obvious, kind of like comparative advantage. But when you think about it, it makes perfect sense, and it casts a lot of doubt on the effectiveness of fiscal policy. So, most economists, including classical economists, understand this argument fully well, but believe that in practice, deficits probably do impact output. Your textbook says a lot. I'm not sure I would say it matters a lot. Economists are definitely mixed on how they feel in terms of the importance of Ricardian equivalence in modern fiscal policy. There's been a lot of empirical testing of Ricardian equivalence, and I don't think economists would be out there seriously undertaking an econometric and empirical agenda in their research if they didn't believe that Ricardian equivalence was important in practice. So I kind of disagree with your textbook author a little bit on this point. I would say that most economists today actually have kind of like a mixed opinion about Ricardian equivalence. There's no doubt that the more that people anticipate that their taxes will increase in the future as a result of a tax cut today, the less likely or the less effective that tax cut will be in terms of stimulating aggregate demand. So I would put it that way. So to give you an example, there's a sunset clause in the GOP tax cut for most of us. Right, not for a lot of the corporate tax rate cuts and some of the other rate cuts that apply more to wealthy households, the middle class middle income households. But if middle income households feel like in 5 years the tax cut will be reversed and they'll have to pay more taxes, then it's quite likely that the GOP tax cut is going to have a much smaller impact on economic growth, perhaps than anticipated. Right? We know that Trump and the GOP sold the tax cut by arguing, unbelievably really, that we would end up with 6% growth. I don't think anybody ever really believed that would happen. But certainly some conservative economists believe that the tax cut might be able to increase growth, or those who supported the tax cut anyway, might believe, were willing to believe that the tax cut would raise GDP growth at least back to maybe 3%, and it didn't. The high watermark for growth over the post-Great Recession recovery has been about 2%. So, maybe one of the reasons for that is that the tax cuts wasn't more effective than we anticipated, or that some anticipated it would be. I was not in the group of economists who anticipated that there would be a large growth impact from that tax cut, and there wasn't. But for those who did anticipate a stronger impact, maybe they weren't fully accounting for the idea of Ricardian equivalence. So I already gave you a simple numerical example of Ricardian equivalence with the $1 tax cut. So here's another idea for you that kind of goes along with Ricardian equivalence and the idea that households need to perceive what we call a permanent change in their income in order to respond strongly in terms of their current level of consumption. So this is what is often called the life cycle or permanent income hypothesis of savings and consumption. And the life cycle and permanent income theory. So the life cycle theory of savings was attributed to an economist by the name of Modigliani. He was an Italian economist. He came up with an idea that can be easily represented in this graph down below, which I'll explain in just a second. And then the permanent income hypothesis is basically equivalent to the life cycle theory. And it was promoted, this version was promoted by Milton Friedman, who is a Nobel laureate in economics and a very well-known, well, he called himself a monetarist, but he would certainly fit the mold of a modern new classical economist. And so both economists really doubted that a fiscal stimulus would have much of an impact on the economy, at least in terms of boosting consumption, either directly or through a multiplier effect, because households like to smooth their consumption over time. So on the horizontal axis here we have age in years, and this is the expected date at which you die. So unfortunately, everybody dies eventually. And the idea is that your income fluctuates over your lifetime. So the way that your income fluctuates over your lifetime is shown by this graph, which at first climbs steeply. So, up to maybe this point here, you might be like a student in college or something like that. You want to maintain a relatively high level of spending to maintain your standard of living. And that's what's depicted by Y, this flat line. So this flat line you can think of as your consumption, and you want to smooth your consumption out over your lifetime. You don't want wild fluctuations in your consumption. So for many of you right now, while you're students, your income might be growing, but when you're younger, you might need to have more spending than your income in order to support a constant level of consumption. And throughout that period of time, you're a dissaver. Okay, and then eventually, your income will begin to grow, and you will earn more income than is required to support that constant level of consumption. And when that's the case, you become a net saver. So up here, you're a net saver. Why are you saving? Well, because you anticipate that maybe one day, like, you'll retire or something. And when you retire, your income will fall back down to something that's lower than what is required to support this constant level of consumption that you desire, and you will become a dissaver again. So you're dissaving here because your income is below the consumption line. You're dissaving early in your life, and in the middle of your life, you're a net saver in the anticipation of becoming a dissaver again in the future and paying back with interest everything that you borrowed when your income was below your desired level of consumption. And so what this means is that transitory changes in income are not going to impact your level of consumption very much. In order to shift your level of consumption up or down, both of these theories suggest that you need to see a permanent change in your income. Right? If it's just a transitory change in your income, it's not going to have much of a perceivable impact on consumption. So you can imagine this: if you're walking down the street and you look down and you find, $10,000 in an envelope, you have, and there's absolutely no way to return it to whoever may have dropped it there. Right? It doesn't happen every day. What the permanent income hypothesis suggests is that you're not going to go out on a $10,000 spending spree. Instead, what you're going to do is take the $10,000 and put it in the bank, and you're going to smooth the consumption of that $10,000 out over a long period of time. And the same thing is true for fiscal policy or a tax cut. If a tax cut is not perceived as being permanent, it's just transitory, then people are not going to dramatically change their amount of consumption, either directly or through any type of a multiplier effect, in response to that change in taxes. And so this suggests that consumption should be fairly stable as income fluctuates not only over a person's lifetime, but over the business cycle as well. And if you recall, we compared the Great Recession to other recessions over the post-war period, and we actually did find that consumption, household consumption, was remarkably stable over the business cycle. And so Ricardian equivalence is likely to be part of that story. The life cycle and permanent income theories of savings and consumption are likely to be part of that story. And indeed, in a more complex model and in a more advanced macroeconomics class, we would be able to take those two ideas and tie them together in a pretty straightforward way in one single representation of household choices about consumption and savings, and including taxes in this story directly. Okay, so there's the first objective. Now, the second objective, understand why fiscal policy and aggregate demand, aggregate supply makes real-world implementation of fiscal policy seem easier than it really is. So here we're going to cover 4 sub-objectives. Briefly, I need to really move on here for you. I'm going to talk a little bit about crowding out. That's an important one. We're going to explain the limitations of the government's knowledge of the size of the multiplier and the level of potential GDPs. We'll talk about that. We'll explain the limitations surrounding the actual politics of the budgeting process. And we will explain how the size of the debt can be problematic if it grows too large as a percentage of GDP. That could reduce the effectiveness of fiscal policy because of people's adverse expectations about people can, in other words, could focus a lot more on what's happening to the debt to GDP ratio, making them pessimistic. They could be focusing more on that than the fact that, they have a tax cut or the government is spending more. So remember that there are assumptions of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model that could potentially be violated in the real world. 6 assumptions of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model that could lead to problems with fiscal policy if we were to relax them. 1, financing the deficit doesn't have any offsetting effects. So what we're talking about here is the potential for what I'm going to call crowding out. So we know that the government finances its deficits by issuing bonds, that issuing bonds drives bond prices down, that drives interest rates up. And investment spending and even household spending on durable goods and automobiles is sensitive to changes in the interest rate. So it is possible that this financing of the deficit raises interest rates and directly lowers investment and household spending on durable goods, creating an offsetting effect to the fiscal stimulus. We have not fully accounted for that in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Second, the government knows what the situation is. So in order to effectively implement fiscal policy, the government needs to know the size of the multiplier. It needs to know the size of the GDP gap, the gap between GDP and potential GDP, which leads us to a third but closely related issue. They need to be able to estimate the level of potential income accurately, and that's very difficult to do. It's one thing to estimate GDP. We can do that with a reasonable amount of accuracy, but remember that the full employment rate of unemployment and potential income are both theoretical constructs, and so the only way to measure them is to measure them indirectly using statistical models. And anytime you use a statistical model to estimate these things, there's going to be what we call a margin of error. And the margin of error in estimating potential income is quite large. Okay, so finally, the fourth thing here is the government has the flexibility to change spending and taxes. We know that a vast majority of government expenditures are mandatory. They're not discretionary, right? So that limits their flexibility to change spending. And we know that Republicans and Democrats like to argue a lot about what you're going to spend money on and how much you should spend. So we all saw the political haggling surrounding the $2 trillion stimulus package, and we should expect that in a democracy. And I think ultimately the bill that was passed was better than the original bill that was proposed. But it can take a long time to get these things done. And if the fiscal policy comes too late, particularly if the economy kind of recovers on its own before the impact of the fiscal policy kind of kicks in, then the fiscal policy may be the opposite of what's needed when the fiscal policy is actually realized. Okay, so it's important to be able to pass these policies quickly and then to implement them quickly. And I know that they're saying that the checks will start to show up to households in May or something, right? If everybody went back to work tomorrow, if we're able to end social distancing tomorrow, which I don't think we will be able to do, of course, but if we were able to, then the economy may recover very quickly, and all those stimulus packages would show up in people's mailboxes as the economy approached potential GDP, and then the impact would be to open up an inflationary gap, not fix a recessionary gap. I don't think that obviously isn't what's going to happen. I'm just using that as a hypothetical example. Finally, the size of government debt doesn't matter. Well, we know that that's not necessarily true from what we talked about in the previous chapter. If the size of the debt to GDP ratio is already large and it's on taxpayers' minds and consumers' and businesses' minds, then when the government runs large budget deficits to stimulate the economy, the focus may be more on the impact on the debt to GDP ratio than on what people have immediately to spend in terms of a tax break, or the amount that government spending kind of creates employment in the economy and creates income for businesses. So the effectiveness of fiscal policy may very well decrease as the debt to GDP ratio increases. None of these things are accounted for directly in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework. And then finally, fiscal policy doesn't negatively impact other goals. So the government doesn't always have the goal of only reaching potential GDP, right? So fiscal policy, we know, raises interest rates. Suppose those increasing interest rates also appreciate the value of the dollar, and that creates a situation where what we export becomes more expensive to foreigners, and that appreciation of the dollar causes imports to become cheaper, and that exacerbates the trade deficit, which we know is another policy goal of the federal government right now. Trump is pretty big on trying to lower the trade deficit. So these things have impacts on other policy goals. Fiscal policy would have an impact. We know that we call the trade deficit and the fiscal deficit, we call them twin deficits, right? And so if we have other goals in mind, other than just stimulating the economy to full employment, fiscal policy may not be the best choice. So here's a crowding out example for you. Crowding out is the offsetting of a change in government spending by changing private expenditures in the opposite direction. So if we were at Y0 to begin with and we wanted to increase real output, we could use fiscal deficits to do so, and we know that would shift the aggregate demand curve from AD0 out to AD1. That's what this graph shows, right? Now, if there's crowding out, the borrowing by the government in order to finance that deficit is going to push up interest rates. They're out there issuing bonds, driving bond prices down and interest rates up, and the increasing interest rates are going to decrease investment and household spending on durable goods. Households aren't going to be willing to refinance their mortgages or take out home equity lines of credit or purchase a new automobile or a washer and dryer, a dishwasher, whatever the case may be. That's going to shift the aggregate demand curve back to the left. Here I've got partial crowding out. So the crowding out isn't complete, but it decreases, you can see, the effectiveness of fiscal policy, because rather than moving all the way out to Y1, the crowding out effect has an offsetting effect where we move back to Y2. Okay? So that's what crowding out looks like in aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Okay, and then we're left with a smaller net effect. So here's crowding out in practice. You can see, what you can see here is you can see government purchases. What you don't see is the overall government budget. So we know, though, we've done our homework. We know that it was right around 1980 here that the government started to consistently run budget deficits, both through some increases in government spending. You have to remember these are shares, so GDP is growing too. So a constant share would imply that the dollar value of government purchases is increasing. And tax cuts. So typically when Republicans are in office, we see tax cuts, and when Democrats are in office, we don't see tax increases, but we do see increases in government spending. Right, so all of that has led to consistent budget deficits over time, and then you could look for where the crowding out has happened. So we're looking for proportional changes, either in investment. We could have crowding out in investment. It looks like there might be a little bit of crowding out investment in these later years, but this only goes to 2010. Okay, and certainly that it's not fair to kind of end in 2010 and conclude that investment is a smaller share of GDP simply because of crowding out, because we know that there were a lot of other things going on. The economy was just barely recovering from the Great Recession. So looking at a longer period of time here, looks like investment share has been relatively constant. We know that it has actually at around 15 to 17% of GDP. Consumption has been a relatively constant share of GDP also. somewhere in the high 60s to low 70s, 72% of GDP over the entire time period. So where has the crowding out taken place? Well, again, it's taken place in net exports. Okay, we've run a consistently larger trade deficit. So again, what we're doing, and you know this now, is we're borrowing money from the rest of the world to finance our government budget deficits. We're selling a lot of treasuries, and a lot of those treasuries are being sold to foreigners, for example, China, others also, and we had a full accounting of that at the end of the last chapter. So that's where the crowding out has happened in practice. If that money wasn't flowing in from China, that capital, and from other areas of the world, then we would see higher interest rates than we do in the U.S. economy, and we would have crowding out either in investment or consumption. One of these two would have to become smaller if we were unable to borrow from the rest of the world. One of the things about the debt to GDP ratio is that if it got too high and it were to shake investors' confidence in the U.S. government's ability to repay, that is exactly what we would see. We would see sharply higher interest rates, slower growth, a decrease in investment, a decrease in consumption, or maybe at least some combination of a decrease in investment and consumption, and more difficult economic times. So it's crowding out. The government knows what the situation is. So data problems limit fiscal policy's ability to fine-tune the economy. Right? Getting reliable numbers on the economy takes a lot of time. So we track GDP every quarter. Then it's revised a quarter later. So the most reliable numbers are already 6 months old. Right? And the average length of a recession over the post-war period is 9 months. So think about that for a second. You don't even really have an accurate idea of what GDP is 6 months until the numbers from today. You'll know 6 months from now what the economy is doing reliably. And the average recession lasts only 9 months. Now, not every recession lasts only 9 months. So there are clearly going to be some economic downturns which everybody can agree require some type of a government policy reaction. But the truth is, a vast majority of the time, economists are not necessarily going to have all of the information that they need in order to determine whether the economy is in an inflationary gap or a recessionary gap. So, today, in any particular point in time, we may be in a recession and not know it. Now, the truth is that what's happening in the economy right now is so drastic and so unusual that all economists are in agreement that we're in a recession. There's no doubt about it. The unemployment rate is going to be probably 20%, and we haven't seen a 20% unemployment rate since the Great Depression, rather. So this is serious stuff. If Okun's law held exactly, you would see a drop in GDP of up to 40%. That's really dramatic. And when we're clearly in a recession like that, of course, economists are in widespread agreement that something like zero interest rates, unconventional monetary policy, and a $2 trillion stimulus package are justified. But, fortunately, most of the time, the economy is not facing the type of shock that we're seeing presently. So the government relies on a lot of macro models, and they have to predict things like potential GDP in order to get an idea of whether we're in a recessionary gap and need a fiscal stimulus and lower interest rates, or an inflationary gap where the right thing to do is higher interest rates and a balanced budget. So again, just in terms of all this uncertainty surrounding, surrounding data and the data that we need to know what the right policy is, nobody really knows what full employment income is, or the natural rate of unemployment or potential GDP. They all have to be estimated, right? So most economists believe that potential income is somewhere between consistent with an unemployment rate somewhere between 4% and 6%. Okay, so I told you about Okun's law earlier. This 4 to 6% implies that there would be a fluctuation in GDP that would be twice as large. So 4 to 6% would be 2%. And for every 1 percentage point in GDP, we could have a 0.5 percentage point change in the unemployment rate in the other direction. Right? So you're talking about potentially fluctuations of 4% in GDP before economists would be in agreement that we're either in an inflationary gap or in a recessionary gap. And so if you have $20 trillion GDP, just roughly $20 trillion, you're talking about fluctuations that are greater than $800 billion before economists would agree that we're above or below potential GDP. So just, think about that for a second. That's a really a tremendous fluctuation in GDP that fortunately we just don't see every day. Okay. So what we often say in economics is that you really can't use fiscal policy to fine-tune the economy. Right now, a $2 trillion fiscal stimulus to deal with the economic shutdown associated with social distancing, that's not fine-tuning the economy. The economy is clearly well below potential GDP, and we're facing a major economic crisis. So we're not talking about using fiscal policy to fine-tune the economy. We're literally talking about using fiscal policy to save the economy. And then, the right thing to do with fiscal policy is a lot clearer to economists than if we're operating close to potential GDP. So most economists would believe that for all of these reasons, the economy during normal economic times should not be using fiscal policy to fine-tune the economy. Okay, so in most cases, most of the time, certainly not true today, but most of the time, the economy is in an ambiguous state where some economists might be calling for expansionary policy. That would be based on their perception of potential income and the natural rate of unemployment relative to others who might be calling for a more contractionary policy, because they believe that the level of potential GDP and the unemployment rate compared to the current unemployment rate are relatively high, right? So if you believed that the natural rate of unemployment, say, were equal to 3.5%, let's say, because that's close to where we were before COVID-19, and you saw an unemployment rate that was equal to 3%, you would say, well, we're operating beyond potential GDP. We should have a slightly contractionary policy in that particular case. Okay, if you believed that the actual, natural rate of unemployment was higher than the 3.5%, like 5%, then you would obviously believe that we were in a recessionary gap, and the thing that we would be calling for would be some type of an expansionary policy. And the truth is that the U.S. economy most of the time, thankfully, is close enough to potential GDP so that we're in that ambiguous state where economists would not be in agreement about whether or not we needed fiscal stimulus or we needed a more contractionary fiscal policy. Okay, finally, flexibility in changing taxes and spending. A lot of this relates to the material we covered in the previous chapter. Putting fiscal policy into place takes time, particularly if you're going to change anything that is categorized as mandatory spending. You're spending on Social Security, all the non-discretionary spending that we talked about, Medicaid, Medicare, all that stuff would take even more time to negotiate than what we see in the normal budgeting process. And even the normal budgeting process hasn't worked very well in recent years. So there's a lot of haggling between political parties that really puts into question how effective fiscal policy can be in terms of its timing, getting the timing right to stimulate the economy. So a lot of political and institutional realities in the United States today make implementing fiscal policy very difficult. Right? Disagreements between Congress and the President, or between Democrats and Republicans in Congress, or between the House, which is held by the Democrats, and the Senate, which is held by the Republicans, etc., can delay the implementation of an appropriate fiscal policy response for months. Okay, now we didn't see it delayed for months, but we saw it delayed for weeks. But all of these disagreements certainly can help make the argument, help us make the argument that the timing of fiscal policy won't be perfected, even if we can agree that fiscal policy is necessary. Okay. the size of government debt doesn't matter. Again, although there's no inherent reason why activist functional finance should cause persistent deficits. Like I said, the functional finance point of view isn't that the government should always run deficits. In fact, it fully recognizes that deficits eventually need to be offset by surpluses. Okay, but the way that economists think about these things isn't always implemented in a way that makes sense by politicians. Politicians only listen to economists when they find those economic arguments appealing, and then they tend to ignore the rest. Okay, so there's no reason why a functional finance point of view would have to lead to a large to debt GDP ratio, but the fact of the matter is that we do have a large debt to GDP ratio. Okay. So politically, it's easier for the government to raise spending and cut taxes than it is for them to raise taxes and cut spending. And so over time, we've seen consistently larger budget deficits and a growing debt to GDP ratio. And again, this just ties right into what we did in the last chapter. Most economists believe that a debt to GDP ratio of 90 to 100% can be destabilizing for an economy, even an economy the size of the United States. But again, we know there's no hard and fast rule as to exactly how much debt any particular economy can take on. It's not a one-size-fits-all number, this 90 to 100%. Okay, and finally, like I said, there are other goals besides just achieving potential income. Fiscal policy may conflict with those goals. Okay, right, when we run an expansionary policy, I've already mentioned the trade deficit will increase, and at least the current president is very skeptical of the benefits of running any type of a trade deficit to finance the government budget deficit, and he's made it an explicit point of policy to try to lower our trade deficit. So a society has many different goals, right? Achieving potential GDP is just one of them, right? And these other national economic goals, like balancing the trade deficit, will conflict with fiscal policy and the goal of achieving potential income. Okay, so that's it for this video. I'm going to stop here. We're going to do another brief video covering Objective 3 and wrapping up the semester shortly. Take a break.